Thank you so much, Devin, and thanks to NC Live for hosting this webinar. Myself and my co-authors are excited to be here and talk about the TRLN Guide to Negotiating Accessibility and E-Resource Licenses. So a bit about what we're going to discuss today. So after some introductions and disclaimers and acknowledgements, we'll discuss our accessibility journey, then walk through the guide and how it's structured. Then we'll discuss how to use the guide and our plans for the future. So just a bit of housekeeping. So if you have a question, please add your questions to the Zoom chat throughout the presentation today. And my colleague Virginia will be moderating and reading them aloud at the end. To help her locate the questions, we ask that you add a cue before the question, and that'll help Virginia pick them out. So first off, we're just going to go through some introductions and a disclaimer and an acknowledgement. So I'm Kelly Farrell. I'm the program officer for the Triangle Research Libraries Network, for TRLN for short. And I wanted to introduce my co-authors of the guide who are co-presenting today. So maybe as I call out your name, you can give a quick wave so people can see you. So Beth Ashmore is the Associate Head Acquisitions and Discovery for Serials at North Carolina State University. Megan Kilb is the E-Resources Librarian and Head of Monographic Orders at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Virginia Martin is the Head of the Electronic Resources and Serials Acquisitions at Duke University. And Abigail Wickes is the Electronic Resources Management Librarian for Duke University. So a bit about TRLN. We're a collaborative organization of Duke University, North Carolina Central University, North Carolina State University, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The purpose of which is to marshal the financial, human, and information resources of their research libraries through cooperative efforts in order to create a rich and unparalleled knowledge environment that furthers the university's teaching, research, learning, and service missions. So the TRLN Guide to Negotiating Accessibility and E-Resource Licenses is one of our many collaborative projects for our consortium. A lot of the consortium's work is undertaken by working groups charged with a focus. So one of the working groups is the Electronic Resources Management Working Group. They're established in 2019, and they're responsible for the joint acquisition and licensing of electronic materials. In 2022, a subgroup formed around the need for guidance in requesting and negotiating accessibility assurances and e-resource licensing. And this turned into creating and publishing the guide we're going to talk about today. So just a disclaimer before talking about the guide itself, we want to offer that the presentation and the guide itself are not intended to provide legal advice. Interpretation of the laws pertaining to and governing digital accessibility may differ by state and institution. It is critical to consult with the local Office of Accessibility, council offices, or any in-house attorneys in negotiating licensing agreements. Myself and my co-authors are not lawyers, so we cannot provide legal advice. We also want to acknowledge that each institution has its own policies, constraints, and approaches to e-resource licensing that may change how this presentation and the underlying guide is utilized. We encourage attendees of this presentation and users of the guide to think about how they might make incremental change at their institution and advocate for accessibility assurances in their e-resource licenses, no matter how small. Just want to call out that Appendix 2 of the TRLN Guide to Negotiating Accessibility and E-Resource Licenses includes reflection questions to help library staff consider these issues locally. So at that, I'm going to pass it over to Beth to talk about our accessibility journey.
Thanks, Kelly. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So when I personally think of accessibility, I think of the Maya Angelou quote, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." As we learn more about the struggles that our students and our colleagues and sometimes ourselves face, we make better choices to bring down barriers or provide accommodation to support equitable access to our libraries. Sometimes we need a temporary disability like a broken foot or an arthritis flare-up to demonstrate just how important accessibility is in our spaces and our resources and our services. As individuals, we are learning all the time about how we can improve libraries to make them more accessible. And this work will never be done, but in the good kind of way, not in the bad way. Charting the development of our institutions, becoming more aware and willing to make changes in the name of accessibility can be a slightly harder process because it's one thing to know better and often a much harder thing to do better, especially if it means a significant amount of money or time or disruption. This can be particularly true when it comes to acquiring and licensing e-resources, especially when those e-resources are requested by subject librarians or faculty or students, and they fail your accessibility standards, and there are no accessible alternatives. We can find ourselves in a corner where we have to decide, do we purchase the inaccessible resource and hope for the best for our users? Or do we tell the subject librarian or faculty member or student that we can't purchase a resource because it isn't accessible to all users? This decision to buy or not to buy is often not something that an individual can decide, but instead it's tied to those institutional policies and standards. And those are going to vary from library to library. And like Kelly just said on the previous slide, each institution has its own policies, constraints, and approaches to e-resource licensing that may change how this presentation and the underlying guide is utilized. Even within this TRLN group, even within the electronic resources management group, each institution represented has a different approach to e-resource licensing and acquisitions. This tension between wanting only to acquire resources that are accessible to all users and having policies or practices that allow for the acquisition of resources that are not accessible to all users is a big part of the reason that we wrote this guide. All of our libraries are somewhere on this continuum on the slide, from not evaluating resources for accessibility at all and not requiring any accessibility terms in the license, to the other end of the continuum, to only purchasing accessible resources and requiring accessibility terms and licenses. The TRLN Electronic Resources Management Working Group recognized that even if our policies and practices do not explicitly prohibit us from purchasing inaccessible resources, we can still advocate for standards and practices that will make our resources accessible and communicate to our vendors that accessibility matters. Next slide. So as we walk through the guide today, you will likely be able to determine which, if any, of the license terms we discuss are deal breakers for your library. If you were to view this webinar a year from now, your deal breaker assessment might be very different, because just like us as individuals, when our institutions know better, they do better. So what can we do as individuals to help our institutions do better? Well, first, we can have the conversation if you haven't already. As Kelly mentioned before, you can use our question guide in Appendix 2, and I'm going to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper in just a minute, to help kick off the question process, that conversation, to see where to begin, kind of bringing accessibility into the acquisitions and licensing conversation. Use that conversation to determine what your deal breakers are, if you don't already know, and also determine what license terms you will advocate for but will not require in a license. Now, as Megan is going to walk you through the guide in the coming slides, you will get some idea of how this guide can help you with giving you language and strategies for your advocacy. We may not always be successful in our negotiations, as we all probably well know, but the simple act of asking has real value in pushing the accessibility conversation forward. And when we don't ask, no one can say yes. And finally, take advantage of all the wonderful resources that are being created every day to help us understand why accessibility matters, and share this context with your colleagues. Abby's going to talk about finding and building your community around accessibility. And while our guide focuses primarily on advocating for accessibility with vendors through licensing, accessibility advocacy is so much more than that. Resources like this very NC Live Learning series and the Library Accessibility Alliance's webinar series are a great place to start helping yourself and others in your community get on the same page about why accessibility matters to us all. Okay, So let's dig a little deeper into the conversation and into Appendix 2 of our guide. So what kind of accessibility conversation are we talking about? Well, actually, it's a lot of conversations with different groups. So before we speak to content providers, we want to know what our institution, where our institution stands on a few issues. And I'm going to ask a bunch of questions that kind of relate to these topics. So, forgive me for just peppering you with questions. What kind of commitments do you need from a vendor? For example, if a content provider does not require licensing at all, will you pursue it to get accessibility guarantees? Or potentially you'll say, well, okay, if you don't have licensing, we still want a VPAT, and that's enough commitment for you. But what do you plan to do with that VPAT? How will you use it in your workflow? And do you have the expertise on your team to know how to evaluate it and potentially make purchasing and negotiation decisions using its information? If we're negotiating a license, will we accept reasonable efforts to make materials and platforms accessible? Can your organization absorb the risk that kind of leaves open for you? Or could you reduce that risk by requiring other language elsewhere in the license agreement? Where does accessibility fall in the vendor's development priorities? Is there a development roadmap that includes accessibility? Are there external audits like the Library Accessibility Alliance that does a lot of evaluations of platforms that provide a sense of like, what are the major problems? Is the VPAT filled in? Is it filled in accurately? There are many levels to VPAT completion. Your library may have a policy that says this resource doesn't meet our accessibility standards now, but we have all of this documentation that shows that it will, so it's okay to purchase now. And that may be kind of how you stair step your way, to more accessible resources. Where do accessibility requirements fall in your acquisition priorities? Do you have a mandate for accessibility compliance that comes from the very top of your institution, or is it a more wishy-washy commitment? Does your organization have the bandwidth and workflows for evaluation and remediation of materials? If so, what are those workflows? Where do they live? If not, what do you have the bandwidth for? We can only do so many things. And so sometimes figuring out kind of right sizing what you will do can help you figure out where all of this fits together for your organization. And will accessibility be a consideration in a multi-year agreement? Will it be part of your exigency language that you might, add to a multi-year agreement? For example, like something that kind of is the spirit of, if your platform fails to meet our accessibility standards, we are allowed to leave this deal. Because platforms change all the time, and year one may be great, and you'll get a platform migration, and year two is not so great. Internally, we want to have a conversation about how we plan to handle accessibility. And this kind of gets at some of that workflow stuff. Does everyone have the necessary information about why accessibility matters and how we plan to make it a priority? When a resource is not sufficiently accessible or we are unable to get the licensing language we require, who's on the team who discusses the next steps? Is it subject librarians, or are they, drawn in? Maybe library council is drawn in. And then what does that conversation look like? How might we advocate further? Like some of the things we're going to talk about in the guide. Are there other accessible resources that could be acquired instead? And what does that process look like? What role does accessibility evaluations and licensing language play in acquiring or renewing a resource? Again, what are our deal breakers? What's the workflow and who makes the call? And how do you communicate that call back to selectors, faculty, or students and content providers when a resource will not be acquired because it fails accessibility standards? Having these conversations, even if the answers to these questions aren't immediately clear, ensures that your institution is making progress on that continuum towards acquiring exclusively accessible resources with licenses that require that compliance to your accessibility standards. So now I'm going to turn things over to Megan, who's going to dive into the meat of the guide and the licensing language and advice on how to advocate for it.
Sure. Thanks, Beth. All right. So I'm going to take you on a guided tour of the negotiation guide. When our working group was drafting this model accessibility language for our larger licensing principles document that goes through all of the licensing elements that we look for, we reviewed model accessibility language from other consortial agreements like Center for Research Libraries, the Big Ten's model agreement, Viva from Virginia, and then also the NERL agreement. And if you spend a lot of time with these agreements, you'll notice that the most preferred version of the accessibility clause, it often includes a lot of different provisions. It covers a lot of ground. But in real life, when you're negotiating an agreement and you just copy paste that whole big wall of text into a draft, it's very unlikely that the vendor is just going to accept the model language as it's written on the first try without any of their own modifications. So once the red line draft comes back to you with the vendor edits, maybe with some comments from them about why they made the edits they did, you've got to figure out if you can live with what they've sent, if you need to ask the vendor questions for clarification, and or if you need to make additional revisions to the accessibility clause to meet your local standards. And like that scenario of like, what do I do now? That's sort of why we built this guide to guide people through those next steps until you get to what feels like a final draft. So this guide breaks down that wall of model text into 6 different components that we listed here. And here's how we've broken down our model language. We expect vendor compliance with the American Disabilities Act. We expect vendor compliance with Section 508, vendor compliance with the Web Content Accessibility Guideline Standards, or WICAG. I'm going to dig into that piece of the guide next. We want the institution to have the right to modify any content that we find inaccessible. And we expect the vendor to respond to and remedy any complaints that we make or any features that we notice that aren't accessible. And I'll dig into that piece later on as well. So you'll notice that most of the model language puts a lot of expectations on the vendor, and it expects them to comply with a range of applicable standards and legislation. So I'll take this opportunity to remind you that having strong language in your contracts is not the same as having the capacity to enforce and to monitor vendors' compliance with the strong language in your contracts. A lot of what you might be willing to live with in accessibility language is going to come back to what level of labor your campus can bring to monitoring vendors' compliance with these terms, reporting any detected issues that they find to vendors, and then pushing them and checking for effective resolutions and kind of tracking those issues. What you might require and need may also vary depending on what you know or what you can find out about a vendor's past performance with respect to accessibility. Again, I will just point to Appendix 2 as a helpful tool to help navigate these issues internally. We love Appendix 2. We keep like pushing you to look at it, so don't forget the appendices. So for each of the 6 components, the guide addresses 5 different issues that are listed here. We gave example text for each component. We gave an explanation of what the language means, how the component of accessibility might relate to other parts of the agreement, an explanation of why you might or might not need to secure the language, and then some strategies for advocating for that component of language with the vendors. So next, I'm going to dive into a specific section of the guide so you can see how these issues come together for each component. Next slide. So our first part of the guided tour is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline Standards, or WICAG. And as we compiled this information, just a disclaimer that we envision the guide to be used as a reference tool rather than as like a monographic work that you might read and consume from cover to cover. If you do read it straight through, that's great. But you'll notice that some of the text is kind of repetitive across sections, but the rationale also behind the need for various pieces of language holds true across these components. So I pulled out WCAG for us to talk about. And we start out this section with just some example text from other model agreements and how those particular consortia expect their vendors to support the WCAG standards. You'll see a few different iterations of this text from the different agreements. And we just want to emphasize here that you can directly copy paste any of these language examples. You can use some combination of them, or you can craft your own model language about the standards to kind of best meet your institution's needs. Next slide. Okay, next up, is a straightforward explanation. We feel like it's a straightforward explanation for what the language is about. I'm not going to read it all out loud. It is fully available in the guide, but if you're working with a provider who's maybe never considered accessibility compliance before, you might have to go into some more detail about what the expectations are for complying with the WCAG standards. This section gives a brief overview of what those guidelines are, considerations for how you might express compliance with WCAG in the agreement. WCAG has different levels of compliance. There's A, AA, AAA. So for example, UNC Chapel Hill has a campus mandate for digital accessibility, and it currently states that our vendors have to comply with AA level or higher. And I've lost my place. Oh, but as WCAG keeps evolving and issuing stronger guidelines, it's possible that our local mandate might also be adjusted to higher levels. So right now, we've opted to not reference a specific level of compliance in our formal agreements. A lot of our contracts will remain open for many years. So we might go a full decade before we renegotiate a full agreement for a resource. If we wanted to, we could like keep pushing for updated language and renewal amendments. But having done that recently, just to get accessibility language in as many agreements as we can, that adds a lot of extra time and friction to the renewal process that already feels pretty compressed. So for right now, we're trying to make our preferred accessibility language as evergreen as we possibly can. All right, next slide. So the next issue that we address for this component is its relationship to other parts of the agreement. If you've been reviewing or negotiating licenses for any amount of time, you'll know and have experience that you can't just look at one clause or piece of a clause in a vacuum. The language is always working together with other parts of the agreement, kind of for better or worse. So in the case of mandating that vendors comply with the standards, a strong agreement will outline what happens if the vendor falls out of compliance. How will they respond and work with you when you report issues? Will you treat an unresolved issue as a material breach of the agreement? If so, do you have a termination clause that offers you enough leeway to terminate the agreement in case there's something wrong with the accessibility features of a platform? And does it provide a timeline for the vendor to fix any inaccessible features? Do you have any idea of what a mutually acceptable remedy might look like? Do you expect the vendor to fix like a platform-wide issue within 14 days? Would it be okay instead if they provide you like a development roadmap within 14 days that details when they're going to be able to fix the issue? And what you're willing to live with might also vary depending on the platform or the resource that you're licensing and its cost and its exposure across campus. Again, Appendix 2 is here to help you gauge where your internal risk boundaries are overall, both like overall as an institution, and then also for particular platforms and providers that you're working on. All right, next slide. So next up, do you need this language? And again, we're not giving legal advice, but this is the section where we aim for straight talk. If you were just going to like ask us at a coffee service at a conference, like, should we be doing this? This is how we would probably respond. So WCAG in particular is important because it's an internationally recognized set of standards that's developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which is the main international standards organization for the entire internet. So even if you're working with vendors outside the US who might balk at references to US federal legislation, WCAG is the language component that allows you to hold them accountable for providing accessible platform features that are comparable to what's expected in the ADA or Section 508. As with other components, you'll need to decide if you're willing to live with vendor edits around them making commercially reasonable efforts to comply with the standards. And as we've noted here, like if you're working with a vendor where they won't even commit to any kind of minimal efforts to comply, or where they won't even commit to strive towards compliance, that's a major red flag. You'll want to dig deeper and gauge the platform's actual compliance and have some conversations locally about your risk tolerance with this particular resource. Is this a critically necessary resource? Are there alternate resources available? Those kinds of questions. All right. And how to advocate for the language of vendors. This might be my favorite part for each component because it provides you with some verbiage that you can consider and modify as you need to when you're justifying any language requesting or conversations with vendors. Having this boilerplate text ready to help you justify your local needs is really important when you're negotiating. I've worked with a number of providers where they don't want to cede any kind of ground in the agreement unless I can provide like a chapter and verse reference to North Carolina statutes to justify the edit, or maybe if I just wear them down after a number of drafts back and forth. So most of the time this back and forth is, it sounds dramatic, but it's just happening through track changes in Microsoft Word, or maybe it's like a string of bullet points in an email. But after a few rounds of passing drafts back and forth, it's not unusual for conversations to shift to real-time conversations over conference calls. And I found it helpful when accessibility is still an outstanding issue to look at this how to advocate for the language with vendors for each of these language components to kind of prep myself for those conversations and kind of have like these words ready in my mind, so I don't have to fumble for them when I'm on the call. So in the case of WICAG, again, we've asked our guide users and readers to consider whether or not they'll live with making reasonable efforts. You'll see information about what avenues of recourse you might pursue if a vendor falls out of compliance or is found to be non-compliant in the middle of the term. This section also points to internal testing as a mechanism to determine if a vendor is complying with WICAG. Appendix 1, in this case, Appendix 1, provides a number of freely available tools that you can use. They're freely available to everyone, not just to us, but also to our vendors if they would also like to do an assessment of their own platforms and resources. So again, I'll reiterate, local testing and assessment is an area of work that requires expertise and bandwidth that's different from the work involved in negotiating the license. The testing certainly informs the licensing and vice versa, and all of the local conversations that are happening around risk tolerance. But it requires additional staffing and expertise that falls outside the direct scope of this guide, but it is still critically important in the process. So that was WCAG. Next, I wanted to walk you through the vendor or the licensor's response and remedy section, since we've talked about relying on this section of the boilerplate to protect institutions when you're not able to secure the assurances that you'd prefer around vendor compliance. So I broke up this particular section of text into 4 different parts. Bringing accessibility related issues to the vendor's attention and requesting or demanding a solution, expectations that the vendor will respond and resolve the issues quickly, providing a specific timeline for the vendor to remedy the issue, and then also granting the licensee or the institution the option to treat any failure to remedy these issues as a material breach of the contract. So next slide, explanation of language. So it is very typical for me to encounter pushback on this particular section of the model accessibility language. Vendors usually want a lot of documented flexibility in their timeline to resolve issues, and they want to know what kinds of issues we're likely to bring to their attention. So it's another area where your local needs and your situation are going to sort of help inform how you plan to hold vendors accountable and what language you might use and what you can live with. Historical service experience with a particular vendor might also inform the types of flexibility that you're willing to grant them in writing in a formal contract. So like I said, when we're working through this section, the vendors will ask, like, what are you going to bring to our attention? If you have a process for conducting your own audits for your platforms, or if you've conducted some version of a widespread audit of your licensed platforms recently, you'll have a sense of what kinds of issues are most likely to rise to the surface. And if you don't have that kind of detailed information at your fingertips or stored as part of like your institutional knowledge bank, you can cite the need to respond to user reported needs quickly and promptly. When students and end users report accessibility issues, and my experience is that those needs are typically tied to a time-bound course assignment. So even if the vendor cannot overhaul and repair a platform-wide feature quickly, we expect them to be very motivated to work with us to produce an accessible copy of the materials in question. Because typically a user is working on a very tightly defined timeline. So this particular section will generate a lot of great conversations with vendors about what resources they've invested in accessibility, how they're working with third-party vendors to ensure conformance to the standards, maybe what their development roadmap might look like, and what kinds of services they might or might not offer to handle one-off requests. But when it's time to knuckle down and commit to language and writing, the language you settle on might still feel pretty watered down. So that's why we suggest including a termination clause. As we've noted, terminating the contract is a last resort option. But if accessibility is critically important to your institution and you hit a wall with the vendor where they can't or they won't take responsibility to remedy accessibility related issues with the content that ultimately prevents user access, you need an exit clause and you need a way out. So I have not ever been in a situation where we've terminated a contract in the middle of the term because of an intractable accessibility issue. But insisting on including this language signals to the vendor that we consider this to be really important, and it's their responsibility to take ownership of making sure their content is accessible for all of our users. So, next slide. And like I said, with the WICADG clause, any accessibility clause that you work into your agreement is going to be working in conjunction with the other clauses in the agreement. So here are a few issues that you might want to consider alongside whatever vendor response and remedy language that you secure. So as referenced above, you'll want a clause that asserts your institution's right to terminate the contract if they materially breach it. I've noticed most of the standard agreements that are generated by vendors don't include this clause. You have to add it yourself. Usually the agreements will outline the conditions under which the vendor can terminate the contract, but they won't really say much, if anything, about what leeway the institution has to terminate the agreement. So if you're not already asking for some kind of a mutual termination clause, you might consider adding it to your checklist. The guide itself includes the full text of a suggested clause that we pulled from California Digital Library's model agreement. If you're working with an agreement that covers subscription resources, you'll want some language around pro rata refunds to get your money back if you have to terminate the contract early because of an accessibility issue. You might consider if there's a dollar threshold where this language becomes required versus optional. Like maybe if you have to terminate a $2,000 subscription midterm, you're willing to eat those partial costs. But if there's some multi-resource platform agreement that has $50,000 worth of subscriptions with a widespread accessibility issue that goes unresolved, you'll want a mechanism to recover those partial costs if you have to terminate the contract. And then finally, for subscription-related agreements, keep a close eye out for auto-renewal language or cancellation notices. So like if an agreement mandates that you have to contact the vendor with a cancellation decision 60 days before the end of the subscription period, but then that 60 days goes by, but then 45 days before the end of the cancellation period, you notice an accessibility issue, and then it goes 30 days without getting resolved, you're only 2 weeks out from the end of your subscription period. And you don't want to be on the hook for an auto-renewed subscription with a major accessibility issue on the platform. So we've included some language here that you can try to include. Notwithstanding the foregoing, outstanding accessibility complaints at any point during the term will serve as grounds for non-renewal or early termination of the agreement. I really love to say notwithstanding the foregoing. It's one of my favorites, like licensee things to say. It doesn't necessarily negate everything before it, but it's kind of a good way to have the last word about something that you care about deeply. So next slide. For vendor response and remedy, do you need this language? If you can get a vendor to agree to all of the other components that came before this one, that they shall or that they will conform to all of the most current WCAG standards, that they'll conform to federal legislation and everything else that we've outlined in the previous components of this guide, you might be able to slide by without this language. That said, that unicorn agreement and that unicorn vendor has never crossed my inbox, but if you find them, let us know, because we probably want to license their resources. So our collective take after asking for accessibility for a few years is that yes, you do need some version of this language. We've outlined above and in the guide both some contract elements that might be in play, and then a few real life scenarios that would warrant including some language in the formal contract about how the vendor will respond to and resolve issues. So if you feel like the language about conforming to ADA, WCAG, Section 508 is not as strong as it should be, if you detect or the vendor acknowledges in conversations that there are some shortcomings with their platform, accessibility-wise, or if there are accessibility updates that are coming down the pike on the roadmap, but they're not quite there yet. These are all circumstances that you can uncover during the negotiation process that suggest that accessibility is an area of risk for the institution and more importantly, a known issue for your end users. So you want to include some version of this language. And then finally, it's prudent as a rule of thumb to include this if you're entering into a multi-year pricing deal, kind of like the scenario Beth was describing a little while ago, or if the agreement in question is going to cover a lot of content that's widely used across campus. We have agreements that have been on file for a long time, so adding in this response and remedy language really helps future-proof agreements a bit and hopefully provides your future institutional selves some flexibility to make good decisions and more broadly meet our user needs. Next slide. And finally, just to wrap up this section, we talked about this element a bit in previous slides, but including response and remedy language in the accessibility clause, again, it signals to your vendors that you mean business about accessibility. If they haven't prioritized accessibility before now, they need to start. I often hear, well, this wasn't an issue for you the last time we worked on an agreement together, or maybe we accepted a more watered down version of an accessibility clause 6 or 10 years ago, and they want to just pull that language out of the file cabinet and reuse it. They don't want to talk about contingencies around what happens if they fall short of conforming to these widely accepted standards. But I have to tell them, I'm like, we're in a different position now. Our licensing priorities have shifted. We have different needs, and we expect our vendor partners to shift in that direction with us. So in closing, y'all have stuck with me through a lot of commentary about a really dry licensing language. So I will point back to Scarlett Galvan, she's now at Grand Valley State. She spoke at the NC Serials conference a few years ago. One of the quotes from that keynote that stuck with me and that I love is that expressions of value and power happen in license agreements. That seemingly dry text that lives in these license agreements, it has real implications for how our users can interact with the content that we're investing in. And the license agreement itself provides us an opportunity to demand more and better from our providers in a really meaningful way with respect to accessibility. So thank you for riding along on this guided tour. I'm going to turn the mic over to Abby to talk about other ways that you can use the guide in your everyday practice.
Thank you, Megan. So I'll be going through a few examples of how we've already used this guide in practice and anticipated updates in the future. My voice is a little hoarse after a yucky daycare germ made its way through our house, so thanks for bearing with me. Part of the inspiration for this guide was the valuable conversations we've had at the TRLN ERM working group meetings. I'm going to go off script and just say how much I appreciate being in the room with these smart people. Like, I've learned everything I know from this crowd. It's immensely helpful to be able to share your situation with colleagues in similar roles and hear what has worked well for them in the past or get their ideas for more successful negotiation strategies. As a side note, this is another reason to try to avoid confidentiality language in e-resource licensing, but that is another topic. We've already put the guidelines to use in a few different ways at Duke. We've had challenging negotiations with international licensors who refuse to agree to our preferred accessibility language because they're not liable to US law, and having the guidance to, quote, ask the licensor to acknowledge that the licensee must comply with the ADA and then ask them to comply with international standards such as WICADG instead gives us a potential path forward. It's also been helpful to bear in mind that VPAT is a tool for communicating about accessibility, and it can be just as easily used to demonstrate that a resource is not compliant, which can help with decisions on whether or not to push back on this language if a licensor wishes to omit it. And finally, the long list of assessment tools in Appendix 1 have also been very helpful resources for some local accessibility evaluation and assessment work that we've been trying to do more of. So be sure to take a look at those. Next slide, please. We hope the guide will also be a way to get accessibility on colleagues' radars. At Duke, we recently pointed to the guide as a resource for providing more context for requested accessibility changes in a particular license for a non-English language resource where we were collaborating extensively with one of our colleagues for translation assistance in negotiations. And our colleague wanted more context to help her explain our requested changes to the provider. So the guide was a very useful resource to share with her. The guide can also be a helpful tool for building understanding that prioritizing accessibility in negotiations can hold up licensing and therefore hold up access. This bigger picture of the work that goes into setting up e-resource access can help manage expectations on the time-consuming nature of licensing, especially if colleagues in other departments or divisions share the belief that this advocacy work is important coming into the process and worth the additional time it may take. All institutions have different capacity for advocating for accessibility, and we hope that this guide will support different institutions identifying the advocacy they have the bandwidth for, whatever that may be. Next slide, please. As many people viewing this presentation can likely relate, we're negotiating new licenses on a regular basis, and sometimes it feels like each new license is a new accessibility language adventure. So there will be many opportunities to update the guide based on new accessibility licensing challenges we encounter. So for example, we recently negotiated or in the midst of negotiating a license where the licensor was advocating to only be liable to their own personal internal accessibility guidelines rather than any of the nationally or internationally recognized standards. We've also recently negotiated a license where the licensor was unwilling to take on any accessibility accountability for themselves, but they were attempting to deflect it all to their content platform provider. So we're curious what their content platform provider would think about that. Um, Not only is the work of licensing ongoing, standards and technology related to accessibility evolve and change, so today's compliance can fall out of date. So these are all examples of situations we've encountered since like hitting the publish button that might make their way into a future version to provide some additional context for how to approach these new situations. We don't have a finalized maintenance review plan for the guidelines. We expect to return to them periodically in the future and then fold in additional topics as we encounter them or as new standards and tools emerge and we collectively learn how to do better. Next slide. So thank you so much for attending. Virginia will be looking for questions in the chat, but if you think of questions later, please feel free to reach out to any of us directly through any of the links on that slide.
Okay. Well, I think that is the end of our presentation, so we can go ahead and move into the Q&A portion of this presentation. And excuse me, I also have been sick recently, so please forgive my croaky voice. We only have one question in the chat so far, but it's a really good one from Trinita White. Trinita, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but she asks, what do you do when vendors won't negotiate? And that is a hard one. So I will take a first pass, but I'm sure that my TRLN colleagues will have some other ideas. So one strategy we use is, so we'll mark up the license and we'll add our preferred language, and then sometimes we'll get it back from the vendor and then we'll just be all rejected, right? And so that's basically, at least on the first pass, a refusal to negotiate. So what we do is we don't just let it go. We say, oh, looks like we're going to be having some back and forth for a while on this, because at Duke it's considered a deal breaker to get certain types of accessibility language into our agreement. So we might start by saying, like, what part of this language do you object to? Would you be willing to accept these parts that are more critical to Duke, and send those questions back? And so you try to start a conversation with the vendor and try to get them to engage on some of the particulars of what you're asking for. As Megan said, a lot of times we submit these big walls of accessibility text, right? But each of our institutions have a different perspective on like what the most critical parts of that wall of text is. So if you can start engaging with the vendor on like what the parts are important to your institution, what parts do they not like, it's kind of always a surprise to see with different vendors which are the parts they don't like. It seems to like not be consistent among them. I guess just like it's not consistent among the different institutions. So I'd say that's a good starting point. Any thoughts from other presenters?
I can add to that. In some cases, we've also, before we've even started negotiations, just outright asked, like, are you open to negotiations for this? Because that can kind of like set the conversation down a different course. I don't know that that's applicable in all situations, but that can be helpful to know going in how receptive they would be.
All right, well, I hope that gives you some good ideas, Trinita. Next question I see in chat is from Gwen. Do you have any recommendations on leveraging username password access that may come with many membership purchases? For example, print copy with username password digital access. Gwen, I'm going to ask if you could expand a little bit on your question about what you mean by recommendations for leveraging that sort of kind of often like single user access that comes with print.
Yeah, I was. Can you hear me if I pop in like this?
Yes.
So I'm kind of new to this world, but I've been seeing a lot of this type of thing, and I've seen in the public library, the reference desk will have a little sheet of username passwords for all the public folks coming in. And we know how often those change and get lost. And what I'm starting to see is there's a real, do you have IP authentication? But a lot of the smaller niche publications can't support it, but still have something special that folks here would want. So just, is there, and maybe the answer is just no, and you're pretty much just looking at things that are IP authentication, larger scale. But the question is there a way to still take advantage of those little guys who don't offer that? You know, on an institutional level.
I'm happy to take this one too, because Duke actually has its own spreadsheet that we use for something similar. So this is maybe less related to accessibility, but as far as different authentication methods into resources and like the license agreement. So often with these little one-offs, there will not be a license agreement, right? So you first have to start, is your institution comfortable with that? Assuming you are, or you've pursued licensing this access, which may be a heavy lift for like comes with online access to a print title. We often make sure that the username password it's allowed to share it. So that's the pivotal question. If it's username password access only, is it intended for a single user, like a single named user, or is it intended to be like, is it okay to share? So that's what you're looking for. I mean, if it's not okay to share, you can't use it at an institutional level. If it is okay to share, you then have to face the hurdle of like, how do you communicate to your users that that this is a username password based access, and how to get that username and password, and then who maintains the username and password. And depending on kind of like, there could be like a whole appendix too, just for like authentication mechanisms of like, what is your institution willing to put up with? Like, do you have the staff capacity and workflows in place to like maintain these various username and passwords, make sure they're not getting shared outside of your institution, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways to do it, and then you have to decide kind of institutionally what your policy is, if you'll use them or not. We try really hard not to set up access to that sort of thing, but we will make exceptions if someone can make a really compelling case for doing so.
Thanks very much, Virginia. That's a great answer. And I think that that's important to note. And I don't know if there's such a jargon that you can ask membership type subscriptions to say, hey, can you add this, that we can share this within our institution? Because I think it's a very gray area. I don't see any language like that. And I haven't seen a whole lot of contracts or anything, but just,
Mhm.
little proposals on pricing. And it says, we
Yeah,
got
it's
this.
something, I think you ask exclusively that. Is this intended for use by a single user, or can we share it within our institution? And then if you are signing off on something, having that written down in the contract, it's always best practice to anything for accessibility or anything else, anything that's clarified in like the comments or like through email, get it written down in the agreement so you don't have to wonder about it later, or whoever comes after you has that
Gotcha.
information.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mhm. So we have a couple of more questions from Astrid. So first, how can a cataloger help with this discussion of advocating for accessibility and/or accessibility with vendors? Any thoughts from the group?
Astrid, I just went to a webinar on this the other day and was talking about it with a colleague who is also finishing up library school at this point. So it's your question's very timely. There's a lot within MARC that can be and I'm saying MARC because, like my library is not in a linked data world just yet. So, but there's a lot within MARC that can be used to leverage providing more information about the accessibility level of your resources. And I'll be honest, I've done cataloging since 2005, so a long time. And I don't think I've ever thought about including that in records. So there's a whole world to explore. I think also catalogers, support your licensing colleagues. be that other person to talk to about, oh man, I don't know what to say to this, or just like to have those accessibility conversations with and like build that community, I think is super important, because it's like everybody's job, and that's why I think, you see in most libraries there's an accessibility committee, and it's because it's like, oh, we all got to do it. Like we each have like a little part to play in it. So I would say definitely look out, and potentially I can give Devin the webinar if I can find the webinar that I attended, because I bet it's like available online for free somewhere. I can pass that along to go out with like slides and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to
Okay.
do that.
Cool.
And then Beth, you might be good to address Astrid's second question, which is related. Where else can I get information on accessibility in libraries besides being a metadata assistant? I'm in my last semester of my MLIS, and accessibility metadata is an interest of mine.
Yeah, I mean, there's like accessibility is hot right now. Like there's a lot going on. It's a good time to be interested in accessibility. It's sad that, like I said, that back in 2005 when I was making those records, I wasn't thinking about it at all. I feel bad about that part, but it's, there's a lot going on now. I would say some good places to start would be like Library Accessibility Alliance is always a good place to start, because that's just like a huge community and there's a lot going on there. And also I am on it currently, so I, have to rep. In terms of specifically with metadata, definitely like I will provide this webinar that I think will be a good place, because I know there was also a bunch of resources that they recommended as well. There's also within ALA some accessibility groups within the different, like within ALCTS, there's an accessibility group that potentially would be a good place to find other catalogers and other metadata people who are in that accessibility space. But I'll make sure to get that information to Devin, and so she can send that out with the evaluation and any other information post.
So we don't have any more questions in the chat, but we have a few more minutes in the webinar. And so I wanted to get a question out to y'all that might be useful to the attendees. So if any of you could share some strategies for advocating with vendors about product accessibility outside of the e-resource licensing process, for those folks who maybe aren't working on licenses like Astrid, who's interested in advocacy around accessibility with vendors, what are some other ways or tools that people can use?
I would say make it a regular part of the product update meetings, like when vendors want to come visit or when you're walking around the vendor expos at conferences, ask like what kind of accessibility updates are on the horizon, like what improvements are you making to your site that are going to improve accessibility related features.
I'd also say that a VPAT is only as useful as you're willing to read it and review it and confirm it. And so if you can build it into your workflows and that you actually get a VPAT from a vendor, take some time to really like unpack it and check their work. I'm sure it's come up, it's happened before that the VPAT did not actually match what the vendor was putting out there. And so it's a useful tool to have and carry into conversations.
I would also add, in answering my own question, just that so as part of acquisitions, which licensing may or may not happen as part of like the acquisition staff work at a given library, right? But what you can do is during a renewal negotiation, apart from the license itself, you can bring up accessibility questions. And if you're able to commit staff time to evaluation, Abby has been working at Duke on doing accessibility evaluations of resources on trial, so that we can go back to the vendor at the time of acquisition and use as negotiating point. Like, well, can you address some of these issues or tell us more about what's going on with accessibility before we commit to purchasing this resource? That's another, it's earlier in the acquisitions process when you can address accessibility. And looks like there's one more question in here from Gwen. Can anyone share experiences of requesting refunds from a vendor who is not addressing accessibility issues? I have not gone down that path before. I don't know if any of my colleagues have.
We have not either. Like, I will say, like, on that continuum, we are maybe not as far along as I would like to be. That's a tough one. Megan?
We had, I'm not going to name names. We had one resource that we didn't renew it because they wouldn't let us get any accessibility license in there. And there was something else, like there was another deal breaker clause going in there. But it was critical for the for that stakeholder group on campus. And so the licensing just shifted to a different department on campus that was willing to absorb that risk. But the library said no. So
I think it's a great question and really emblematic of the tension that exists between successfully licensing the resource so that your patrons can access it, but also standing up for like your values and principles within the library. And I mean, there's risk mitigation, which is what the university cares about. But I think one thing we can all agree on, that like making our resources accessible is also like the right thing to do and is an important value of the libraries. So, but it can be very difficult to stand up for those values when you have resources that you can't get anywhere else.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think you guys, I really appreciate that you guys kind of just opened up the door to start asking these questions, because they're important. We don't hardly have any print materials anymore, right? So we have to be able to let people find this stuff. So thank you for this awesome presentation.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you everyone for attending. We're 2 minutes before the top of the hour, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. Devin, do you have any closing remarks?
I have nothing prepared beyond keep an eye out for the follow-up email that I'll be sending today with the link to the recording, the slides, a follow-up survey. If you loved this session and you got a lot out of it, please let us know. We'd love to continue to offer more things like this in the future. And that sort of feedback is very much important in our decision-making process. And I will also include links to all the recordings that were shared in the chat, so that if folks want to watch even more training and webinars on accessibility, you're welcome to do that. But that is it. Have a great rest of your Thursday, everybody.